Good evening, Exiles. Sticky Jim here, and today's video is going to be quite the doozy. This is going to be an encyclopedia for Tainted Pact, and everything you need to know about it using it in your builds. The target audience is those that have no idea what Tainted Pact is and why it's powerful, those interested in using Tainted Pact in their builds but don't know the intricacies of enabling it, those that want to know the fundamentals of building something around something else. Maybe you like the Iron Mass or whatever your favorite unique is in the game. Kind of understanding the fundamentals of how to build around something is the core of this presentation, so I hope you learned something there. And also myself. This is going to be a long one-take seminar-style video with a minimal script. And I'd love to gather feedback both professionally and as a new content creator. Pacing, brevity, what have you. Even if you don't like or leave a comment, liking comments that you agree with goes a long way in identifying constructive criticism. I know I might be asking for a death sentence as someone who's chronically online, so, but this is a channel all about positive vibes. I'm sure we'll get through it, and I do appreciate anything that you guys have to mention about the video too. There's a lot of information we need to go through. I know many of you may not have an hour plus to watch this entire thing, so please feel free to use the timestamps in the video. Check out the slides in the description below. This is a culmination of years of in-game experimentation, and it did take weeks to pull together, so I would appreciate if you could subscribe to the channel, leave a like, comment your thoughts and feedback. I really do appreciate it. Alright, what am I going to be yapping about for a little too long? First off, what is Tainted Pact, my history with it, and why it's good. There's going to be multiple reasons why it's good, but it does take a lot to enable and a lot to think about whenever you're mapping with it. So we're going to go into a deep dive on how to get Leech Uptime, efficient ways to enable poison, and then obviously the opportunity costs of running Tainted Pact. We're also going to move through some offensive and defensive synergies with the amulet, and then some real-life build examples that I put together in 3.26 and understanding some of the decisions I made with those builds. And then at the end, we just have an important message about the future of this channel. I am a newer content creator, so I just want to talk about my thoughts for future videos or just giving a few shout-outs where necessary. So if you could stick around for that piece, I would appreciate it too. Alright, so what is Tainted Pact? Tainted Pact is pretty useless outside of that one line that's highlighted. Taking chaos damage over time heals you instead while leeching life. This is insane. But it is hard to enable, and that's why I have that puzzle piece to the right. It's kind of a puzzle to understand how to make it work. You know, some of the time, all of the time, and some builds will require it more than others. We'll get through that, but just as like a basic concept of the amulet itself, or the amulet itself is just, it's a T3 rarity unique. You can get an easy corrupt for it, and the price is 1 to 5 chaos. It's a pretty cheap unique. I think it's slept on, but we'll go through why it's kind of fallen out of favor. So I remember back in 3.21, Tainted Pact was introduced. Everyone was talking about how this is going to break the game. It's going to be so good to have this amulet. Building around it is going to be insane. And then they quickly fucked around and found out that you will kill yourself pretty consistently if you don't have all of your ducks in a row and understand how to enable the amulet properly. Then 3.22 came along. In Crucible League, Karn came out with the Bone Shatter Slayer with Tainted Pact. I tried it and I was immediately hooked. From there on out, I was like, you know what, this is my favorite unique in the game. Let's keep doing some crazy stuff with it. I remember Yausis made the build of the week around it. We'll actually reflect on that on a later slide. I ended up making 2 different types of trauma stacking slayers that league. And then in 3.23 through 3.26, I just had a scattering of a bunch of different builds that I put together. Doesn't have to be, you know, you think about poisons, you think, oh, it has to be a physical or chaos build. No, not really. 3.23, I put together a cold splitting steel slayer. I made a video about that a while back. That was before I was actually talking on videos and just kind of uploading a showcase. I put together a life stacking splitting steel Deadeye and Slayer. And in this league, I actually had 3 different builds. The Cyclone Shockwave Slayer, the Rakiatas Flicker Strike Slayer, and then the Life Stacking BV Slayer, which I made a video about probably a couple months ago. That was probably my favorite implementation of Tainted Pact I've made thus far. So if you have a moment, check it out. Maybe I'll link it. I'll figure out how to link it on the YouTube video at some point. But either way, it's kind of like a running joke among my friends. I always say, oh, I've got some hot technology in this league, and they're like, oh, you're going to build around Tainted Pact? Yeah, asshole. I'm going to build around Tainted Pact. Call it what you will. Maybe it's a touch of the tism, but it's probably my most favorite way to play PoE, and that's what it's all about. So why is Tainted Pact so good? So the main reason why it's good, and this is probably about 70 to 80% of the power just from this, which is reflected poisons. When we reflect poisons back on ourselves via this golden rule jewel, so if you look at this bottom line where it says poison you inflict is reflected to you if you have fewer than 100 poisons on you, you can get upwards of, let's say, 100k life regen per second. And I need to showcase this in-game. So this was my character that I was talking about before. This is the BV Life Stacking Slayer. Not going to go through the intricacies here, but I am just going to load up this random map I have here. It's just a white map just to kind of show you what's going on with my health.
Abandon this fool's errand, I beg of you. If you do not...
And you can see it's a sacrifice build, so my health is going to be constantly going down. But you start reflecting poisons on yourself, and you'll see in the top left corner where we have 1 to 15. Our health is just bouncing back to full pretty much instantly whenever we're moving around and running into packs. This is just an insane amount of regen to the point where I don't care about any sort of avoidance on the build. I don't need block. I don't need evasion. I don't need any sort of ability to just avoid damage, just because if I'm going to be back to full health a server tick later, who cares if I get hit twice in a row, as long as it's not on the same server tick, which is like, what, 1/30th of a second? So that allows me to cater my builds to really invest more into max hit. And we'll go back to the slides here. A nice thing about this regen too is it's unaffected by regen and recovery modifiers. It's technically negative damage. So I do have a separate video showcasing this as well, where I ran a map with, I think it was 108% less life recovery rate, and I was still able to have the exact same life regen that you saw in the video, or that you just saw a minute ago. And then, like I said before, with a regen like this, who needs damage avoidance? EHP is fake. EHP meaning, like, you might have the max hit, but then you'll see a lot of 100,000 effective hit pool for builds that are running Svalin or something like that. The only thing we care about is just making sure that we don't get one shot, because two shots don't really exist when you're healing that much. Here's my crappy, my paint skills are definitely on point here, but as you'll see in a standard build, you usually kind of want to balance recovery, max hit, and avoidance defensively. But for Tainted Pact, we just go all in on recovery. Recovery is so insane that we can take points out of avoidance and then just throw the rest into max hit, and basically be immune during mapping, as long as we have all of our ducks in a row and all of the requirements for Tainted Pact to be working are there. Another reason why Tainted Pact is good, it has a really good synergy with Divine Flesh. This comes from the Glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel. I think it has to be dominated, or dominated, whatever the word is, by Zabaqua. Divine Flesh makes it so that 50% of elemental damage is taken as chaos damage, and while we're leeching, that means that we're taking a chaos dot, so that means we're healing from it, right? So imagine that you have 80% max elemental resistances and 80% chaos resistance. You take a 5,000 damage per second elemental dot, you're going to be taking 2,500 of that as elemental, and 2,500 of that as chaos res, or chaos damage, but technically that chaos damage is healing you, so it nets out to 0. This is amazing for builds that are weak to dot. I want to point out Petrified Blood is kind of the main offender here. I know Petrified Blood really suffers with dot damage in the first place, but I'll talk about Petrified Blood later as actually an enabler for Tainted Pact, so it's a really good synergy there. But you can actually make it go further. So if you have a higher max elemental resistance compared to your Chaos Res, you can actually heal from self-inflicted and enemy dot. Some good self-dot abilities are Righteous Fire, Annihilation's Approach, Shimron, Nebulok, those sorts of things. And then obviously having 100% uptime on Righteous Fire can be crazy for spell builds. It is a little bit difficult to do, but same thing with Annihilation's Approach, but being able to actually heal from those rather than take the damage is pretty crazy. And then obviously when it comes to Elemental Max Hit, you'll have to balance having a high maximum Chaos resistance and reduced Chaos damage taken modifiers so that you can take less elemental damage. Thinking of things like the Fourth Vow, and we'll talk about some of the defensive synergies too, but I just want to at least bring those up before we get there. This is kind of my clickbait slide. Tincture Uptime is actually insanely good with Tainted Pact as well. So looking at the ability for us to basically jump back to full health every server tick, there is a keystone on the passive tree called Blood-Soaked Blade. What this does is instead of mana burn, you have Weeping Wounds. What Weeping Wounds does is because every second or every mana burn you have is 1% of your mana per second being drained away. This replaces it with 1% of life being drained away, and when you're regenning as much as we are, we really don't care. So we can turn on a tincture, and as long as we have poisons reflected on ourselves, we're not going to feel the blood-soaked blade at all. This means big DPS and uptime. I know a lot of PoE ninja builds are kind of bait when it comes to tinctures. They'll turn it on for maybe 3 seconds, and then you have to wait 8 seconds for it to turn back on again. This kind of gets around that, and it makes it so that you don't need Warden to actually dip your toes in the tincture pool. I like to call it the mini Mage Blood for tinctures, just because you can actually have modifiers like 35% increased effect and not really feel it. So all of these modifiers on here will be scaled up by that increased effect as well as tincture quality. And then, of course, if you have a tincture with increased melee weapon attack speed, more attack speed, attacks per second means more poisons and QOL. Just being able to zip around the map with, let's say, Shield Charge or Leap Slam. And then, obviously, the more you attack, the more poisons you can have. It kind of scales upon itself. And then we have Warden Ascendant. I think it's looking pretty good, just because here we have, you can have an additional tincture active, which if you didn't have the Warden Ascendancy, this would be trash. Because like I was saying before, if it's clickbait in the first place, having double clickbait doesn't really matter. But the entire Ascendancy, so Warden actually has just 1 point dedicated to you can have an additional tincture active. Adding these other 2 on top of it is just really good value from the Warden's perspective. So I'm thinking about making a build around this next league. Something to do with Sap of the Seasons and maybe another tincture. Just a little... And I'm kind of excited to build it, so we'll see what happens, but I think there's a lot of potential in the tincture market here. So, what's the catch? There's 3 different things we need to think about with Tainted Pact. There's obviously the Leech Uptime, which is probably the most difficult piece to understand, and we're going to go into kind of a deep dive here, so bear with me. When it comes to Leech duration versus Poison duration, your Leech duration must be higher than your Poison duration. If not, you are going to die. It's funny because in the corner of the chat box, it'll actually say, like, you committed suicide because you reflected the poisons upon yourself. Let's say you have a poison duration of 2 seconds, and then you hit something really softly, you reflect the poison, that's 2 seconds. Your leech only lasted 0.5 seconds. Right as the next server tick past that 0.5 seconds happens, you're going to take the full brunt of that poison duration. And that can kill you real quick. So, a little more about Leech duration, if you don't really understand how Leech works. I'm going to try to explain this as quickly as possible, because Leech is kind of, its own dissertation at a certain point, but generally what you can do as a default is you can hit something and you can leech from that thing for a maximum of 5 seconds. Slayer is a little different. We'll talk about Slayer in a bit, but Slayer can actually have a 10-second leech. Your hit, so life leech percent multiplied by a single hit of damage should be more than 4% of your character's maximum life. And I say 2% of leech per second for 2-second poison duration. So a single leech can heal you up to 10% of your life over 5 seconds. I would say 10% is a nice thing, or a nice benchmark to go for, just because if you're riding up along that line of 2.2 second leech duration over the 2-second poison duration, you run into a mob that has less damage taken, you're going to get destroyed. So having a little bit of wiggle room along those lines is a good idea. Also thinking about leeches, dot builds really have no or low hit damage, so thinking about like your ignite builds that historically have had trouble with regen in the first place, you might need to skip out on stuff like Deadly Ailment support, which reduces your hit damage by 80%. I don't have too many dot builds around Tainted Pact in my arsenal, so this is something that's kind of new territory for me. Obviously, we can look at like Viper Strike or things that are kind of hybrid, but it is a little bit more difficult to do so in that vein. Just keep that in mind. And of course, you have to invest in life leech percent, and I kind of have like a hierarchy of how available they are. Fizz attack is super available, and maybe I did lie to you before about Tainted Pact having some useless lines, but it does have a built-in 2 to 3% of physical attack damage leeches life, which can be useful for some builds, not for all, of course. And then there's a ton of it on the tree, and then a lot of uniques have it actually as a line item, and then I think some weapons can also have it too. So it's plentiful for physical builds. Overkill, this is kind of my cheat code for Slayer build as well. So we have 20% of overkill damage is leeched as life. I use this in that BV Slayer build that I was using before. This allows you to, and because it says overkill damage, don't care if it's physical, don't care if it's elemental, don't care if it's attack versus spell. And then 20% is just a huge percentage overall compared to what you might find on the tree. And then, you look at Tainted Pact, which gives you up to 2 to 3%. 20% is just a massive amount. This can kind of help you get around some of the other things you might have to run into with dot builds or spell builds that don't really have a lot of options for getting life leech, but it does require the Slayer, so it might not be applicable for everything. I just wanted to point that out. You can get generic attack life leech pretty consistently as well, and then specifically elemental and chaos are kind of hard to come by. So there might be a few. I'm thinking of like what's the notable on Cluster Jewels, Doriani's Lesson, which is 0.2% of elemental damage is leeched as life. Not a lot. And if you're trying to hit this threshold of 10% of your maximum life on a single hit, you might need to invest a little bit more than you'd like to make sure that this leech duration is the full 5 seconds. When it comes to some quick enablers, I know that there's the Tattoo of the Kitava Blood Drinker. This is a strength tattoo. It gives 0.5% of attack damage leeches life, which is just super nice and available for a lot of different builds. So if you're an attack build, this can be a quick way to get as much leech as you need. I know Divine Flesh, we were talking about the Glorious Vanity Jewel before. There's some specific leech notables in there, like 0.2% of chaos damage leeches life. You can use Impossible Escape to get more than one if within the threshold of that jewel. You'll obviously have to look up a few things on PoE to get the jewel that you need, but it is an option. And also, Life Leech support can work in certain niche situations. So I'm thinking of, like, I don't know, maybe the Starcaller Axe, where you have Cyclone on a different link. You can leech with the Cyclone, but then have all of your damage links in the Starcaller proc over on the weapon. Stuff like that. There might be some situations where Life Leech actually makes some sense. Another thing, too, is we should be conservative. So thinking about this maximum hit damage, or the hit damage required for a 10% leech. Let's do a little bit of a dive on my build itself. So this is the POB for that life stack BV that we showed before. I apologize, for some reason I can't figure out how to zoom in on POB. We don't have the technology, but bear with me. So if we have an average hit, and unfortunately for my build, the only leech I have for the build is from this notable here. Like I was talking about with the Glorious Vanity, we have the 0.2% of chaos damage leech his life. You might look at the average hit and be like, okay, well, you have 1570613 times 0.002. That looks like more than 10% of my health. I have 598 health. 3,000 is about 20-25%. We're good to go, right? I don't think so. So you want to make sure that, if you're at the start of a map, let's say you just boot up the map and then you run into your first pack. You're not going to have power charges. You're not going to have frenzy charges. You're not going to have endurance charges. Unholy Might is a proc. You're going to have to wait a little bit until you get that. You don't have reflected poisons on yourself. You didn't kill anything recently. You start to see, especially with the withered stacks, you start to take off a lot of these different multipliers. And all of a sudden you're at 430,000. Let's do that. 651 times 0.002. And now we're at 861, which is way below that 10% threshold that we talked about before. It might be 4 to 6%. Something to think about, at least with your builds, just to make sure that you have at least enough leech. And in my instance, we do have the overkill damage, which solves all of our problems when it comes to leech. But if you're looking to enable the leech on your build just through the damage of or through modifiers such as those from the Glorious Vanity Jewel, just make sure that your POB lines up with your expectations. And just keep that in mind. Some other things that we also have to talk about too is Delirium. There's less damage mods and juiced rares. Sometimes those can cause issues because you're doing less damage, which means you're doing less leech. And then of course I just put at the bottom, just do more damage, LMAO. The more damage you do, the more leech you're going to have, the more consistent it's going to feel. But I would say it's not too hard to get a pretty consistent leech when it comes to these sort of things, especially for attacks. Leech is pretty plentiful. You just need to make sure that you're aware of how much you have invested in the build and make sure it's enough that is comfortable for the content that you're running. When it comes to poison duration usually is 2 seconds. There are a few things that you can do to increase or decrease it. Obviously, you can increase the duration of your poisons. You reflect them to yourself. Let's say you have a 20% increased duration of poisons. Now you have a 2.4 second poison duration. But you also need to keep in mind that the longer poisons you have, the leech also needs to match. So I wanted to call out here, there's Apex Supremacy, which will actually make it so poisons expire 50% slower on your build. So 2 seconds turns into 4 seconds, which can actually feel pretty great from a QL perspective. There's also the passive trees. There's skills like Viper Strike. Viper Strike has a 4-second duration built in already. But you want to make sure that you don't scale that past the 5 seconds that Leech might have, or you might want to think about Slayer, where you have that 10-second window for a cushion. You also need to think about debuffs expiring slower or faster, because those actually affect poison duration that are on you. I know a popular addition to 3.26, which is Runegraft of the Warp, that makes it so that debuffs expire on you 30% faster, which means your poison duration goes from 2 to 1.4 seconds. It still feels good. I actually ran the Runegraft on my build. It still feels fine, but just know that'll affect some of the poison durations that you have on yourself. And if you want to extend it a little bit further, just keep that in mind, especially with if you want to run like Temporal Rift or Stasis Prison or anything like that, that will affect poisons. So, also another thing too, Temporal Chains. You might have a poison build, you inflict Temporal Chains on your enemies. That does not translate to you. So if you have Temporal Chains making your poisons go from 2 seconds to 2.5 seconds, you're still going to have 2 seconds on you because you're not the one with this debuff on them. Just keep that in mind. One other thing, Overleech is absolutely mandatory for the build. Overleech means that when your health goes to full, usually what happens if you don't have Overleech, your health goes to full, your leech instance goes away. If you were to poison yourself and then your leech instance goes away, you automatically take the brunt of that 100,000 damage per second and you will die. So I would say Overleech is absolutely mandatory. There's kind of, I would say, 3 good ways to get it and 2 kind of middling ways to get it. The first one being Slayer's Brutal Fervor, like I talked about before. This is the 2x leech duration, which is the 100 increased maximum recovery per life leech. That gives us the 10-second leech. And then this line here, life leech effects are not removed when unreserved life is filled. That's what we're looking for. Slayer's kind of the goat for Tainted Pact. You'll hear me say Slayer, take a drink every time I say Slayer. But there are other ways to get it. Obviously, there's the Ascendant, which has Slayer. But Petrified Blood is probably the best way to enable it on other Ascendancies. As long as so you can see in the picture here, as long as you have a gap between the low life threshold, which is 50, you can actually increase it to 55 with a life mastery. As long as there's a gap between how much you reserve and how much your low life threshold is, it will consider, leeches will not end when it gets up to that 50 or 55. And I say no life flask here because if you press a life flask and you hit the top of your reserve, your leech is going to run out and you are going to die. So there are 2 other ways. Immortal Ambition, which I'm not a huge fan of, especially because it is a keystone that requires the Glorious Vanity or the Soul Tether Belt. It's obviously on Mahuzadal's Machination, but we can't use that because it has Val Pact. I'll talk about this later. But taking up an entire belt slot or not using the Divine Flesh just to enable Overleech seems kind of not worth it, in my opinion. And then there's the offering to the Serpent Gloves, which has the life leech effects are not removed, but it has a 50% reduced maximum recovery per life leech, so that means your leech duration is down to 2.5 seconds. Don't think it's that worth it either. Alright, so how do we actually get leeches? So there's 3 different methods that I've identified here. This is probably the easiest one, just leeching from map monsters. Historically, this has just been where most builds will get their leeching from. All you need is just the amulet and enough leech, and you just hop on a map and start killing things, and you get leeches. However, you need to watch out for life cannot be leeched from monsters. I think this is kind of the biggest frustration for a lot of people when they're building around Tainted Pact, is they'll run into a rare, they'll slap the rare, reflect the poison on themselves, and then say, hey, why did I just die? It's because the mob you hit has life cannot be leeched from. But there are ways to kind of get around it. One of them being having a higher leech duration helps avoid death between packs. So like I was saying before, Slayer, if you can get up to the 10-second leech duration, you kill a pack beforehand, and then you run into one of these mobs. You still have the leech from the previous mobs that you killed to kind of get you through those. And that's why I think the 10% threshold for other ascendancies, 10% of maximum life as a leech, is kind of important, especially for leeching from map monsters and making it feel a little bit more comfortable. There isn't 100% uptime here because you're going to have to be bouncing around packs, killing things, and then maybe looting some stuff off the ground and then moving to the next pack. Because poisons are only 2 seconds long, obviously you can alter that, but you need to either kill everything in a complete chain or kill things and then finally stop the map and then turn off Righteous Fire. Certain things like like I was talking about with the Divine Flesh enabling your self dot to heal you, you need 100% uptime most of the time to be able to make it so you can use these things. Righteous Fire you actually can't turn off until you hit 1 health, so it's something to keep in mind. And then one other thing which I found interesting, and I've never run into this myself, but I've done some research. This is credit to Wolfio. If you haven't heard of him, go follow him. He's a great content creator and just kind of exploring things about certain uniques. Really interesting content. But apparently, if you proliferate poison, it resets the poison duration when it's reflected back to you. So if you, let's say you send out a 2-second poison that kills something in 1 second. That poison is then proliferated to something else, which has a 1 second duration. It is reflected to you with the full 2 second durations for whatever reason. And sometimes that can cause issues with chaining certain poisons back to yourself. You might lose the leech duration that'll cover you for 2 or 3 instances of poison proliferation. So this can also be an issue with chain explodes. You hit something once and then all of a sudden it starts cascading down the line. You start reflecting poisons that are lasting a lot longer than 2 seconds because they're kind of staggered. So something to keep in mind there, especially if you're doing a poison build yourself. And then for some reason, this is inexplicable to me. Sometimes I will just run into a pack and die right at the beginning of the map. This happens very infrequently, and then I'll just get back in the map and then just go do it again. Maybe it has something to do with the poisons happening before the leech or something along those lines. I say your mileage may vary here. It's just something I've run into beforehand, and I just wanted to point it out. Alright, this leech method is fun, or at least a doozy. It's hard to understand. Feel free to skip the slide if you really want to, but this has to do with Yaus's build of the week and trying to enable this Flask mod that you see here. 15% of damage taken from hits is Leech's life during effect. So this requires a large self-hit or many small quick hits via cast when damage taken. And it also requires 100% Flask uptime. I think the big problem with this leech method is it's easy to enable it if you're fighting against monsters, because monsters you're going to be doing, let's say, 15,000 DPS per poison. That compared to your health is a lot easier to... It's just the numbers are astronomically higher. When you're hitting yourself, generally it takes into account how big your health pool is. So if you need to get, let's say you need to hit yourself with Forbidden Rite to generate a 2-second leech, you might need to have something like a low or even negative chaos resistance to even think about having some sort of a duration from this Flask mod. And then, if you aren't using cast when damage taken, it requires manual casting and being on top of it throughout your map. Might even use like a macro or something, but it's not something I'm interested in doing myself. This seems super clunky. It does work, though. That's why I wanted to point it out. It requires a lot of strange things to enable it. I think one of the weirder things to do to enable it, too, is some people still run Divine Flesh and then have a super low chaos resistance, which means that your elemental max hit is trash. But one thing I didn't go over before, and it has to do with the golden rule, is that the golden rule actually has a plus 1% to chaos resistance per poison on you. So if you're able to have super low chaos resistance outside of combat, and then in combat you're hitting a ton of times, maybe you have overlapping spells. I think that's what Yaus's ended up doing in his build of the week, is just spamming abilities to the point where you immediately have 100 poisons on yourself. It's something that you need to kind of balance in and out of combat, but you can get shotgunned off screen if you're not in combat. It's kind of a problem. Janky, but doable. I just wanted to point that out. Also, there might be some more viable setups once we get into 3.27, which is coming up. Pretty excited about that. I know 3.26 came out with Bladefall of Trarthus, which is kind of like a consistently draining mana skill, and then pairing that with Scold's Bridle. There might be some possibilities there. I looked into some other content creators or forum posts around this, and it seems to be relatively bugged from what I can tell. Whenever you use a different skill other than Bladefall of Trarthus, it shuts off the leech. I don't really understand it quite yet, but there's potential, and it has yet to be explored. If you have any sort of knowledge about this, I would love it if you left it in the comments. I'd love for this document to be a living document too, so I'll go in and make changes where necessary, but we'll see what kind of tools 3.27 gives us. All right, leech method number 3, writhing worms. Why rely on monsters when you can make your own, right? So, 3.26 gave us this new tool called the Squirming Terror Ring. What it does is it shoots out a writhing worm automatically every 2 seconds, and I've found this insanely good for Tainted Pact. It does use a ring slot, unfortunately. There's not a lot of mods on the ring, and that is an opportunity cost that you'll have to run into, but there's a lot of other cool things that you can do with it, one of them being there's a 20% chance to trigger a socketed spell on kill. This is an unset ring, so you can socket something in there, and if you're just on your maps killing things, you can automate certain things. One of my favorite things to do is actually put in Forbidden Rite in the Jewel, and because you're regenning so much, you're not even going to feel the self-hit, but it does enable cast when damage taken to be automated during mapping. One of my favorite things to build around. There is the lose X life on kill, negligible when we're regenning it all back. But there might be some more theories on the horizon. Like I was saying before, I'm thinking about making something around Sap of the Seasons and getting some, 100% poison uptime to make it so that I can have that tincture up with 100% certainty. Cool things that I might be thinking about next season, and then obviously, with 3.27 and later leaks showing up, might even be some more synergies there. Historically, the other thing that people have utilized is Writhing Jar, a classic. It does use a Flask slot. It is not automated, which is kind of the pain point. You're going to have to slap it every so often to make sure that you're able to kill the worm coming from it. I think it's more popular for bosser builds than anything, but it is possible to do in mapping. It does require Flask sustain. I know that there's a few life Flask gain charges, notables on the tree or Pathfinder or anything like that. And then if you're going to use this with a non-Slayer Ascendancy, you just need to be careful that you don't hit the top of your reserved life so that your Leech instances shut off. Just in general, Writhing Worms have a lot of QL. It does give you some uptime between monster packs, so I think Righteous Fire, those other things are on the table again. You get to ignore those monsters with the no leech modifier, which is super nice. I will say that monsters cannot be leeched from as a map modifier is still a problem. We'll talk about that. You do need a high single hit leech to be viable, so like I was saying before, you kind of want to shoot for that 10% threshold marker. Even more so with Writhing Worms because you have one hit or they're gone. It might be easier to do on like a map with a bunch of monsters in a mob. You can hit 6 different things and have 6 different leeches, but this you only have the one worm. So Slayer Overkill is really nice here because the worm health is, I think it's like 700 or something like that. Super low, so pretty much the entire damage that you do, you're going to get 20% of that as a single leech, which basically is one of the easiest leech methods out of them all. And then, of course, with Writhing Worms, you need to make sure that you're not killing them from other instances. So, in my BV Slayer builds, I have Righteous Fire, but I actually have it linked to Brutality so the worms don't get killed from it. I just use it for the 40% more spell damage modifier. You also have to watch out if you're doing a minion build, or in 3.26 there are mercenaries, so those will try to kill the monsters before you do, so just watch out for that. It does work best for Nova-like or auto-targeting skills, so anything that explodes around you, I'm thinking of like Dark Pact or Cyclone, makes it really easy to kill these worms consistently because they'll kind of pop out in randomized directions around your character. Flicker Strike is a nice way to do it. And then I put Shroud Walker LMAO here. So Headhunter is kind of annoying with Squirming Terror because you'll just be running along and then all of a sudden just be jumping to the behind all of the worms as you're going. It's almost like a seizure effect. So have fun with that. But that is pretty much it for the leech methods. Now we have to think about poisons, because if you have your leech uptime, you need to make sure that you're reflecting poisons. You don't need a lot though. you'll be surprised. So adding poisonable damage for your build. Poison by default can be inflicted with physical or chaos hit damage. I want to say hit damage here is very important. You can't use a dot build to inflict poison because the poisons are based off of 30% of the physical or hit damage coming from your weapon or spell, if I'm not mistaken. If you're already running a full physical or chaos damage build, it's pretty much free. Luckily, in the BV Slayer build I have, it's all physical and, well, it's physical converted to chaos damage, but it is 100% chaos damage when the things are moving. But you don't need a ton. This is where you want to use PoB to kind of see the effective poison DPS in yourself. So I'm going to go back to PoB. Where are we here? Here we go. And you'll see I have a single poison DPS. Actually, let me go back and let me refund this because this is with all of the modifiers off. We have a single poison DPS of 32k, but that's assuming that that is the monster that we're hitting, right? And not ourselves. We have a chaos resistance of 80%. So, if we go into the enemy chaos resistance and throw in 80% here, it's looking more like 16k. You can also, if your build has damage reduction modifiers like Slayer has, the 10% reduced damage taken while leeching, you can also take that into account and do like some sort of effective, instead of 80%, we have 20% left, so that's 2%, so it's more like 82. However in-depth you want to go, but whatever the DPS here, whatever you feel comfortable with a single poison, this is where you kind of need to balance how much you want to be able to poison the enemy versus, and then we'll get into poison chance and applying that in a consistent manner, but something to keep in mind when you're applying it for your build. This league, I started doing some theory crafting around pneumatic daggers and Adder's Touch. Looks very good. So Adder's Touch is a notable on the tree that makes it so critical strikes you inflict with daggers poison the enemy. So whatever your crit strike chance is, your poison chance is. And then pneumatic daggers say all damage with hits with this weapon can poison. So you can do elemental damage, you can do anything that you wouldn't think could poison, can poison with both of these added together. Super consistent way to be able to do that. I think just the hard part about daggers is just getting the flat damage necessary to make the build work, but it is a really nice combination to get everything to poison. There are other ways to enable non-fizz and chaos damage to poison, but usually the opportunity cost isn't worth it. I know a lot of people think about Volker's Guidance, which I think the gloves say like your fire skills, cold skills, lightning skills can poison. It reduces the poison duration to 1 second, which feels bad on its own. So I'm not a huge fan of it. It's just, it seems a little janky, and it uses an entire glove slot to get you something that you could probably build off of otherwise in a much less opportunity cost way. So there's also the Inextricable Fate, which are the boots that if I think the enemy has a certain amount of grasping vines on them, you can all damage poisons them. Great for certain builds like Spark, but not consistent enough for Tainted Pact's regen and making sure that it's up 100% of the time. And then there's Beacon of Madness. I've tried building around these boots for God knows how long. There's a certain set of boots that says all damage inflicts poison, which means that doesn't care about poison chance, doesn't care about damage type. It's just everything poisons whenever you hit, which is awesome. But it has a bunch of downsides you need to mitigate. There's some janky ways of 400% debuff expiration chance, which kind of ruins the poison duration on yourself too. So just super hard to build around and probably not worth it at the end of the day. I would say if you're working with an elemental build, there are a lot of ways that you can just convert things to chaos or maybe add chaos damage on top of what you're already doing. And like I was saying before, you don't need a ton. Just go into PoB, you'll be surprised on how much you can reflect to yourself. And even if you only have, let's say, 1,000, 2,000 poison DPS or healing from a single poison, that's pretty damn good, especially if you're going to reflect 10, 20, 30 poisons on yourself. That's still a crazy amount of regen compared to what's possible in this game. So, thinking about a few things here, there's the shield and spell weapon crafted modifier. There's I think it's non-chaos damage added as extra chaos damage. One of my favorite combinations of jewels here, there's all of the nightmare jewels. I got a ping here. No, thank you. Sorry about that. With the green nightmare, it's basically any nightmare jewel from Chayula. It'll say gain 6 to 10% of X damage as extra chaos damage. I really like the green nightmare because spell suppression is just a super high value stat. And because, like I was talking about before, these builds really rely on maximum hit rather than any sort of avoidance. Obviously, you can look at like the block ones and stuff like that, but if we're giving up all avoidance to just throw as much as possible into max hit, this jewel's a really nice option if you are a cold-based build, or maybe try elemental build. Like I said, you don't need a ton. Just keep that in mind. Incandescent Heart, excellent pick for Tainted Pact builds. It has a few really good lines here. One of them that I'm trying to highlight here, which is the gain 10 to 20% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage. That's great. 0.8 to 1% of attack damage leeches life, also good for enabling Tainted Pact. But also has the 25% of elemental damage from hits taken as chaos damage, which in tandem with Divine Flesh, that means that you take 75% of elemental damage as chaos damage, which is really good to just kind of consolidate as much as possible into one damage type, and then you can scale the max hit of that damage type to the moon. Maybe use Juggernaut. We'll talk about the defensive synergies later on, but keep that in mind. There's Etziri's Promise, which is a flask that gives chaos damage leeches life, as well as both physical and elemental damage as extra chaos damage while it's up. Obviously, that means that you need to have that the flask sustain to have that up 100% of the time, but it is an option. Sometimes what I'll do in some builds is if I have like a Fizz to elemental conversion, I'll leave like a small sliver of physical on the builds. Not the best way to do it, especially if you're not doing Slayer, because that means that you have to deal with physical reflect maps. Slayer has the physical damage cannot be reflected, which is nice, but it is an option just to kind of keep that as a poison enabler. And then, of course, if in the same vein, percent Fizz is extra chaos damage if converting Fizz to elemental. Thinking about like bow builds where you have like the Vile Arrow Quiver. Turn all of your physical to elemental, but you still have that extra chaos damage. Voltaxic Rift, which turns all of your lightning damage to chaos. The original Sin, obviously. Good luck affording it, but and then of course check the wiki. I'm gonna say check the wiki a billion times during this presentation, but go explore. There's plenty of sections. Like there's one which is gained as chaos, where you can actually look at what sort of uniques are out there that'll allow you to say, hey, I want physical as extra chaos. Let's sort on physical as extra chaos. Obviously, Ming's Heart is built for it. There's the Obliteration Wand, Spine Hail, what have you. Everything's on the wiki. I'm highlighting probably the most viable of them, but there might be some niche circumstances which it'll work better for your build than you might expect. Alright, so Poison Chance. So I like to say 25% chance is kind of the minimum that Tainted Pact requires. The more the better. This is kind of like a feel-good amount, especially with how fast your build is. If you're a slower build that's slamming once every second, you're probably going to want 100% poison chance. But if you're a build like mine, like the BV Slayer, where you have, I think BV has a hit APS of 8.3 hits per second, which is pretty quick. Or if you're doing like some sort of build with shotguns or returning projectiles, especially shotguns and returning projectiles, because you click once and you can hit an enemy 5-10 times. I'm thinking of like tornado shot or something like that. Super easy to apply poisons that way, but the slower your build, the more poison chance you're going to need. There are some really good ways to get poison chance, and ones that have more opportunity cost but are better allocated for certain builds. And I have kind of like a ranking here, my personal ranking for gold, silver, and bronze. So we'll go over the gold first. They're rare gloves, Eater of Worlds, implicit. This I lean on this a little too hard. I love these as an option. So gloves, you can get an Eater of Worlds implicit, which will get you up to 30% chance to poison on hit. That is agnostic of whether or not it's an attack, a spell. But it is just a really quick way to get it. But if you have your gloves glove slot taken up by something else or other options, intelligence tattoos. There's a tattoo that gives 5% chance to poison on hit for intelligence notables. The right side of the passive tree, there's a lot of 10-15% chance to poison on hit. Sometimes it's poison on hit with attacks. Sometimes it's poison on hit with spells in the top right of the tree. Pretty quick grabs there. And then, like I said before, Adder's Touch with daggers. It's so easy to just say, if I have 100% crit chance, all of a sudden I don't have to worry about poison chance. So, and like I said before, check the wiki. There's plenty of ways to get poison chance. But talk about a few more. There is the percent fizz and chance to poison veiled prefix on rare weapons. Sometimes I'll use this if I'm in the mid to mid-high budget range for certain builds, using a veiled chaos orb. This is an option to get. I think it's 20 to 25% chance to poison on top of your, I think it's 100 to 129% fizz. I might be wrong there. There is the medium cluster jewel that has septic spells. I believe that's 20% chance, or it might be 25% chance to poison with spells. Really easy way to get it for spells. There's the snakebite gloves, which these used to be really, really good when Ralakesh's and Patience boots were broken and gave you a maximum of all 3 charges, but it's a little bit more of an opportunity cost to do now. It does have this line here that says attacks have 60% chance to poison while at maximum frenzy charges. You can enable that a couple of different ways. Maybe there's the Grand Spectrum jewels that raise your minimum frenzy charges up to your maximum, so you never have to worry about this modifier going away. There's obviously the Ralakesh's and Patience jewel or boots with the frenzy mod, which can work with the Olesia's Maven belt. That'll change your frenzy charges into affliction charges if you have a poison build. Really nice synergy there. It is possible to use the snakebite gloves to get a lot of poison chance. And then, of course, because snakebite is a really cheap unique, you can get a lot of cool implicits like plus frenzy charges, so something to keep in mind. And then there's Cosprey's Will. Cosprey's Will says always poison on a hit against cursed enemies. This was actually used in Yausis's build of the week to make it so that he doesn't have to worry about poison chance, especially if you have 3 or 4 different spells going at once. All of them can poison as long as something is cursed in the vicinity of you. This is really good, I think, for slam builds, slow builds that have to worry about only hitting, let's say once per second, or something that you really don't want to lean on a 50-50 for being able to get the regen that you need. This is an option that also helps in trying to get your chaos resistance up. So if you're doing Divine Flesh, Divine Flesh makes it so that you're taking half of elemental damage as chaos, and if you don't have maxed out chaos resistance, you're going to have an issue. But it's not, obviously the chest piece is kind of like a really strong piece of gear that you don't want to just throw to the wayside, so I did put it in the silver category. For bronze, we have, like I talked about, Volker's Guidance before. Not the best. It's just a lot of opportunity cost for something that's just easily dealt with elsewhere. There's the Corlito Signature Flask, which isn't the best because it gets rid of all of your crit damage, I believe. Some niche circumstances where this will work, and then of course you'll have to have the Flask uptime. There's the Icefang Orbit Ring, which might work in conjunction with the Winter Weave, where if you poison an enemy, you can return that poison and chill back to yourself and then reverse that chill with Winterweave. Kind of hard to scale that chill, though, which might be possible with the Alessia's Delight in increasing the ailments effect. So something to think about, but it does take a ring slot, which can be kind of pricey for what it is. There is the chance to poison support, like similar to like I talked about before with the Life Leech support. There might be some niche circumstances where this makes sense, especially if you're a poison build, obviously. But I feel like it's just kind of like a low power support to have in a build. So bronze it goes. There's the Venomous Toxins helmet, which I believe off the cuff that is I think it's 6 to 10% chance to poison on hit per power charge, which is really nice if you have power charges, but at the beginning of the map, it's actually kind of hard to have enough power charges. There's not a really good way to start a map with power charges, so unless you're using like Ralakesh's and Patience, but at that point, I feel like that's also another opportunity cost. And then I threw in something spicy in here with Arakali's Fang. That's the dagger that summons the invulnerable spiders, but it does have a 15% chance to poison on hit. I was thinking of some sort of like active minion builds in order to enable it. I just wanted to throw it in there in case some people take this away and run with it, but it is an option to have a minion build with the poison chance reflected back to yourself, but it is something that you're going to have to be active about and actually hitting things before your minions can kill them. So, all right. Opportunity costs. Obviously, for the amulet, you're giving up a few things to be able to run it, right? So, there are a few negative synergies with Tainted Pact. I think the biggest thing you think about CI or ES stackers. Tainted Pact only heals life. Has nothing to do with ES. It bypasses the ES. It does not give regen for ES. That would be insane if it did. But you want to use this with a life build. So that will chop out, a lot of the meta that we're seeing now in 3.26. Maybe that might change in 3.27, but I want to call it out because it is kind of a big fraction of builds that really shouldn't be running Tainted Pact. Other things that you probably don't want to run with Tainted Pact are traps, mines, and minions. Because you want to be reflecting poisons on yourself, it's impossible to do so with these means. You can't reflect trap damage or trap poisons to yourself. You can't reflect mine damage to yourself. Minions, like I was saying before, it'll kind of be difficult to do some sort of active playstyle, but you have to do the hit that reflects the poison. And then, of course, with traps, mines, and minions, it's difficult to actually get the leech from them, too. There are ways to enable them, but I think the poison, not being able to reflect the poison is kind of the last nail in the coffin anyways. So, Void Forge, Doriani's Prototype, Avatar of Fire, and Brutality. I want to point these out because they say, deal no non-X damage or deal no poison damage, something along those lines. So Void Forge is deal no non-elemental damage. Doriana's Prototypes deal no non-lightning damage. Avatar of Fire is just fire damage, and then Brutality is physical damage. These will turn off your poison damage, so cannot run these. Val Pact, before they changed it, was nice, but Val Pact actually turns off all healing from every other source that's not Leech, including Tainted Pact. I called this out before. Mahuzadl's Machination was a really smart pick for Tainted Pact before because it gave you Divine Flesh on the shield, it gave you Overleech, it gave you so many nice things, but now that they changed Val Pact, it's dead in the water, so don't even think about it. There's Disillusion of the Flesh, which you technically could run Tainted Pact with Disillusion of the Flesh, but it's not really necessary. A lot of the Disillusion of the Flesh users, because Disillusion of the Flesh, whenever you take damage, you reserve your life, and then after 2 seconds it goes away. You're kind of just bypassing the whole reason why Tainted Pact is strong, which would be regenning your health to full in a serve attack rather than 2 seconds. So I would avoid it. There's obviously any sort of immunity avoidance or unaffected by poison modifiers that you just have to watch out for. I'm trying to think of anything that's that's across a bunch of different builds, but I know that there's a few uniques that have like unaffected by poison. I think there's a helmet that has that. Just watch out for those. You can't have those. Reflected bleeds. I don't say it is a negative synergy just because the golden rule also reflects bleeds back to you. So if you are doing any sort of physical damage that has bleed chance, so I'm thinking like a physical build with vulnerability curse, right? Vulnerability gives a 25% chance to bleed. You don't really want to take those bleeds on top of the poisons that you're reflecting to yourself. Let's say you roll the 25% chance to bleed and the 25% chance to poison. You get the bleed, all of a sudden you're dead. So there is a mastery on the tree that makes it so you are immune to bleeds if your helmet has higher armor than evasion. That's a smart pick to do. I think it's an armor and evasion mastery. There's also Apex Supremacy, the shield that I talked about earlier. It actually turns bleeds into chaos damage when you take them, which, great, we'll take the extra healing. But I think it's just smarter to just not have bleeding on your build if possible. And then there's the debuffs expire faster. You don't want to stack this, like I was saying before, with if you're trying to work around like the Beacon of Madness boots or you're running Stasis Prison. That'll just turn your poison duration from 2 seconds to like, less than half a second. It's just not worth it at the end of the day. So I would say the Rune Graft is okay because I do run that for, I think there's the deal no damage for 3 seconds out of every 10. You're going to reduce both at the same time, but just keep it to a minimum, let's put it that way. I think the other big opportunity costs, and this will kind of hurt quite a bit of builds, is the just not having an amulet slot, right? So you have your Tainted Pact in the amulet slot. It's not like you can have another amulet slot on top of it. So for spellcasters, they're going to be losing plus gem levels. A lot of spellcasters will have like +1 all, +1 fizz, elemental gem levels, whatever. They're going to be losing that. Attribute stackers kind of get shafted by a lot of things that Tainted Pact builds want to run. Obviously, attribute stackers get a ton of value from the amulet slot with percent increased attributes, percent increased strength, dexterity, whatever you're looking for, and then the percent increased damage per 15 of a certain attribute. So you're going to be losing that. I would say unarmed and hollow palm. Those suffer quite a bit if you do decide to go Tainted Pact because you can't run Rigwalds, which gives base crit. But also, if you are hollow palm, you probably want to stack attributes, and because you don't have a lot of gear slots, you probably want to not take away one of the most important slots that you have. Obviously, late game Simplex abusers can't run Simplex amulets. So if you're going to go for the +4/+4 gem levels or a crazy amount of crit multi or added life, whatever you want to run with Simplex, that goes away. I'm calling out Yoke of Suffering here because it is really good for elemental builds or tri-elemental builds. It hurts quite a bit in terms of damage, but you can at least work around it. But I will say, if there are build enablers that your build really needs to kind of function, or it's just like such a crazy amount of power that the amulet allows, maybe Tainted Pact isn't right for your build. So thinking about like Fury Valve, if you want to run what is that skill? Frostblades. There's certain builds that Fury Valve just makes clear a hell of a lot better than it would be otherwise. You lose that. Badge of the Brotherhood, if you're a power charge stacker, all of a sudden you can't turn those power charges into frenzy charges, which hurts some builds more than others. Just keep that in mind. Ashes of the Stars, you can't have quality on your gems, especially for stuff like Frenzy of Onslaught or anything that scales crazy with quality. Crystallized Omniscience, it's funny because I always make the joke of, Tainted Pact has strength on it, so it's a great Crystallized Omniscience amulet choice. It's like, oh wait, no, you can't run both. And of course things like Voice of the Storm, giving lucky lightning damage. Just there's a ton of different things out there. If you feel like you lose too much for replacing the amulet slot, you might want to reconsider. Or, at a certain point, maybe instead of having an attribute stacker that does 200 million DPS, maybe it does 50 million DPS and has an insane amount of recovery instead. You just have to make those trade-offs in your mind at the end of the day. The other three I have here in orange are just kind of like maybe you have this in your builds. You just have to think about working around it. So the first one is the Timeless Jewel. If you just do decide to go Divine Flesh, obviously attribute stackers suffer from this too because all of a sudden you're running Glorious Vanity and not Lethal Pride for strength or Brutal Restraint for dexterity or anything like that, and you're losing out on a lot of value there. And then, of course, any keystones not named Divine Flesh, you can't run those unless you get it from a certain piece of gear that also has those. Think of like the Trader for Flask Uptime, like we talked about before. I keep saying, like, hey, this is good if you have Flask Uptime. All of a sudden, you can't run the Trader. It's kind of a problem if you're not Pathfinder. There's Supreme Ostentation, which is the attributes don't count at all, or at least there are no attribute requirements for your gear. I know that I forget that jewel's actual name now that I'm thinking about it. The white jewel that has like a bunch of different notables that are super strong for 10% increased damage per frenzy charge or minion damage. You can't run that if you're running Glorious Vanity. So there's also Inner Conviction, Transcendence. I don't even know if Transcendence is used anymore, but just make sure that you at least have room for the Divine Flesh. And then on the passive tree, because of the way that Divine Flesh works, or the Glorious Vanity, is it replaces all of the notables in the radius. So you want to make sure that you build your tree in a manner that you're not going to overwrite nodes that you really want for your build. You might need to path away from certain parts of the tree to be able to fit this in your build too. Fit this into your build too. So definitely something you want to plan around. So when it comes to flasks, so this is worms or tinctures, if you decide to run either of them. Obviously, there's more buttons to press if you have a flask. I would say the tincture is pretty manageable. You just have to watch out for if you have the tincture up for 20 seconds or something like that, and then all of a sudden you're looting. Your health is going to skyrocket downwards if you're not killing anything, but really not too bad from a micro perspective. The Worm Flask requires investment into Sustain, like I said before, which you might need the right side of the passive tree for. If you're bougie and you have a Mage Blood, obviously this means that if you're running a Tincture, you can't run a Unique Flask. Or you could run a Unique Flask, but all of a sudden you're only getting a 3 Flask Mage Blood for your build. Keep that in mind. And then, of course, Tinctures pigeonhole you into using a melee weapon unless you're Warden. And then also requires pathing to Blood-Soaked Blade, which is in the bottom right of the tree, right next to Slayer. Just take a look and make sure if you are looking on getting a tincture for your build, just be mindful of the pathing to what is necessary here. And then, of course, if you're using Squirming Terror for Writhing Worms, you're not going to be able to run 2 ring combos, so, Winter Weave +1. I don't know how many times I've thought, like, oh, I'll just, run Ice Fang Orbit and Winter Weave, and, wait a minute, can't do that. Anything that wants Kalandra's Touch, so if you're a charge stacker, you have like a Mirrored Heist Ring, if you're an accuracy or attribute stacker, Face Breakers with a bunch of flat physical, you're going to lose half of that, basically. So, especially for, Frenzy or Power Charge stackers that really want just a reflection on the other ring, you're going to miss out on that if you do decide to go with Squirming Terror. And then, of course, the minus mana craft that a lot of builds use to mitigate mana costs. You're only going to be able to run that on one of your pieces of jewelry because you are losing it on the amulet slot too. So just watch out for mana costs while you're building. Some more opportunity costs. You just have to watch out for a couple of map modifiers that screw with the builds. I would say there's 2 categories here. There's the semi-brick and then there's the nuisance. We'll start with the semi-brick. I would say Regic is recommended for Tainted Pact builds when it comes to monsters cannot be leeched from. There are ways to go around monsters cannot be leeched from with Tainted Pact. You'll have to unsuck at the golden rule. Make sure you're not using any health spenders for your build, and then you just rely on leech and regen to get through the map. Kind of painful, so I would say it's pretty mandatory to regex these out of the build, which might be a deal breaker for some people. They might just want to be able to run every single mod. I know in 3.26 there is the Cartography Scarab of Risk, which adds 2 random modifiers to your map. I don't know what it is. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if it's just a fluke, but I ran like hundreds of maps in 3.26 and it never added monsters cannot be leeched from to a map, which I was super surprised about. I'm going to put this here again. Your mileage may vary. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if anybody else has run into that. If you have, let me know in the comments. But it might be something that just can't happen with risk scarabs, which would be really nice. But I'm just surprised. It just seems like a statistical, almost impossibility at this point that that's not the case. But I don't want to promise anything that I'm not 100% sure on. So the other thing too, you probably want to watch out for is monsters have a 50% chance to avoid poison, impale, and bleeding. I would say this is more of a problem if you're scaling up your map modifier effect to the moon. I think it gets up to something like 94% chance to avoid poison, which for some builds is pretty awful, especially if you have a slower attacking build. I would say it's probably not too bad if Risk Scarabs add this as a mod on the side, because you only have to deal with the 50% chance. So all of a sudden, let's say your 25% chance goes to 12.5. It's still doable, especially if you're running into huge mobs on your map. And it is much worse for slower builds. Like I said before, if you're a slam build, this can pretty much break your build. So you just have to be careful whether or not you want to regex it out. I think it's probably a good idea if you are scaling map modifier effect. Otherwise, you might be able to get away with it. I would say the nuisance modifiers, there is the players and their minions deal no damage for 3 out of every 10 seconds. Your poisons are going to run out faster than the debuff, right? So poisons last for 2 seconds, this debuff lasts for 3, so you're going to have 1 second where you have no poisons on you. You're pretty vulnerable in that time window. And of course you can extend your poison duration to be longer than the 2 seconds, but that does require a lot of opportunity costs as well. But you do have the debuff expiration, which does help, which is why I have the Runegraft of the Warp on my build. It does shrink your poison duration and this modifier duration at the same time, but it does kind of close the window a little bit and makes it a little bit less painful. And then there's the area has patches of Awakener's Desolation and Runes of the Searing Exarch. I learned pretty late that these turn off regen entirely. So thinking of like when you fight Maven and you run into the beams at the end, and all of a sudden you're sitting there like an idiot for 10 seconds, just waiting for your regen to come back. These work the exact same way. So these turn off your Tainted Pact healing, and because you have no avoidance on the build, you can quickly get shotgunned by a bunch of monsters. Just remember to keep moving. I know it might be easier for some builds to do that than others, but it is just more of like a skill issue at a certain point to be able to work around these modifiers. Or if you want to regex them out and not deal with them, be my guest. It is up to you, but I just wanted to make sure that it is mentioned here. Alright, so I would say another opportunity cost for some people is how the gameplay feels. With Tainted Pact, you have a lot more power in combat than power out of combat. So like I was saying before, you have the 2 second poisons. If you're just sitting there, looting stuff and something comes off screen and tries to attack you, you're not going to have that regen at your disposal to kill those things. So I would say Tainted Pact kind of encourages fast and efficient map clear. Headhunter is great for Tainted Pact because you want to kill everything, and then all of a sudden at the end you don't care about the poisons falling off of you. You can just kind of loot in silence while you're going back in the map. But I know that there's some people out there, you might be shown in the picture here, you might follow Pox's guides to a T and really enjoy the low APM style of gameplay. You might want to rethink Tainted Pact. I would say it's still very comfortable. It's not like you're leaning forward and fully engaged with the gameplay, but it is something to keep in mind. So You do want to avoid content with a lot of waiting or invulnerability phases if you don't have stuff like Squirming Terror or ways to enable poison outside of being able to hit monsters. So I'm thinking of bosses, and being able to leech and get like Divine Flesh having a 100% uptime. Probably want to avoid that sort of content. And then the more monsters that you jam into your map, the more poisons you're going to get, right? So if you're farming rogue exiles, let's say, you're going to be fighting that one rogue exile and probably not getting a ton of poisons off of them, versus if you're running juiced breach content that has a bajillion mobs, it's way easier to get the amount of poisons that you're looking for. So I would say less monsters equals more investment in poison chance and DPS. A little life regen does go a long way though, so I would say I wouldn't skip out on just base life regen, because outside of combat it does make it feel a little bit more comfortable to just move around and not get shafted by something that appears off the screen. Although you do have a much higher max hit to deal with those sorts of things, but I would say it's definitely something you should at least splash into the build. And like I was saying before, with completing the map first and then loot, there's some deli mirror synergy here where you just kind of want to keep running and running and running and killing as many things as possible. Cancel the mirror and then go back and loot. I would say that works really well for Tainted Pact style of gameplay. Historically, I've done also looting sessions where you just kind of run and then you pick up a thing and then you keep running and then you pick up a thing. 2 seconds is a lot longer than you would think. It keeps you pretty safe if you're looting while killing. And I think depending on how much you invest into poison chance and the ability to up if your poison duration is a little bit longer, this is kind of like a QOL feels good type of gameplay here. If it works for your build grade, if it just feels like crap, if you're moving along and picking up stuff and then your poisons run out and then you die, you might want to think about doing the fast and efficient map clear. But I would say it still feels pretty safe if you're picking up stuff as you go. Writhing Jar, I would say, is probably the most painful addition to a build if you decided to go that route. There's the manual button press, which is kind of a pain to at least have on a timer, and making it consistent for poisons. And then I would say tinctures feel strange at first. The more combat you have, the more uptime you have. If your poisons run out, all of a sudden you're taking 50 mana burn per second, which turns into 50% of your life per second. Just keep an eye on your health pool. It takes a little bit of time to get used to, but it's the power trade-off that you get from it is insane, so I think it's 100% worth it. I would say the last opportunity cost is League Start. I would say Tainted Pact is not great for a League Start scenario, just for the simple fact that damage ramps up exponentially while your life is relatively linear. So you're thinking of like Act 1, you have like 100 life and you're doing 100 DPS. And then Act 5, you have 1,000 life and you're doing, let's say, 10,000 DPS. It's almost like an exponential curve where your damage times leech it's a lot harder to hit that 10-second threshold I keep harping on. As you're moving through the campaign, the more damage you have, the easier it is to make sure that that's comfy. You could obviously scale a bunch of leech modifiers to make sure that this gap is closed, but you might as well just play something else at that point. I would say probably want to hit about 1 million DPS before you transition into Tainted Pact. I think that mostly for the fact that the amulet slot just gives a ton of stats for that single slot, and you're going to be missing out on a lot. I'm thinking of like, even Slayer would just love to have Carnage Heart in there to fix their attributes, give some extra, leech or damage while leeching. It just seems like a hard trade-off to do, and I think swapping to Tainted Pact makes a little bit more sense once the rest of the build can carry without the amulet slot. I would also recommend waiting on Divine Flesh, because capping your Chaos Res early can be pretty expensive and difficult. Might be easier with some builds rather than others. If you're playing an Occultist, you get an extra plus 60 Chaos Res just from your Ascendancy, so Or if you're running, let's say, Cosprey's Will for the body armor, you get a ton of Chaos Res. Might be possible, just something to think about. And of course, campaign leveling might be possible with select skills. I like to say this is not financial advice. I am not a financial advisor. I'm not a professional. Take this with a grain of salt. Tainted Pact does require a level of 42 to even start using, so it's going to be, what is that, Act 6? Something along those lines. I would say it's probably possible with Poisonous Concoction, maybe Poisonous Concoction of Bouncing, because I think that has an inherent percent chance to poison. I would say Viper Strike is also another one that has a lot of built-in things to enable Tainted Pact, but mechanically, Viper Strike feels like ass. it just, there's a lot of things that you need to invest into Viper Strike to make it feel good, especially from a mapping perspective. That it's just, there's a lot of different moving parts that Tainted Pact requires that I would suggest starting with some sort of meta league start builds and then transitioning into Tainted Pact once you're ready. All right, let's talk about synergies. There's quite a few, and this is kind of what makes Tainted Pact exciting. I think offensively, shields have kind of run away with the game. I've noticed that basically every build is wand shield, sword shield, dagger shield. Shields are just super strong right now, and I feel like Tainted Pact closes that gap pretty substantially. Because, like I was saying before, we don't have to worry about damage avoidance if you're using a two-handed weapon. All of a sudden, you don't care about blocking, you don't care about evasion, you just care about hitting things hard and taking a big hit. This does, I feel like it breathes a lot of new life into uniques that would otherwise be outclassed by Sword and Board. So, thinking about like not Annihilation's approach. What's the there's like a staff that triples your elemental damage. Like that feels like crap if you don't have block or anything like that. Dual wielding, obviously you can wield you can add in some block nodes to get up to the 75% threshold, but I feel like Tainted Pact does close that gap pretty substantially, and especially if you're doing a melee build with attacks. Tinctures are just a great way to get a ton of damage, so I feel like this helps to get those types of builds online a lot sooner, and also kind of scale the top end of those builds pretty substantially too, and make them feel well-rounded compared to a lot of other builds that might feel like a glass cannon or only good in certain scenarios where they're not going to get shotgunned immediately. This is just a super nice way to make the builds feel just well-rounded. So I would also say Petrified Blood plus Pain Attunement plus RF, super powerful combination. Petrified Blood plus Pain Attunement. Pain Attunement, I think, is 30% more spell damage while on low life. RF can give 40% more spell damage. All three of these together, Petrified Blood also gives the overlease that we're looking for certain builds, so it's just a really nice combination. Tainted Pact also covers the dot weakness of Petrified Blood. Super nice package, but you do need the 100% Leech Uptime for Righteous Fire as well, so this is where the Squirming Terror might come into play for your build. Just nice to have something to poison every 2 seconds to make sure that RF, or at least to have the Leech instance of 5 seconds be up so that RF doesn't hit you with 100% of the damage and it doesn't have the offset of healing that you would otherwise have. Yeah, you can dip more into self-dot if you have the 100% uptime, so like Annihilation's approach. This isn't only for attack builds, it's for spell builds too. So like Annihilation's approach, you can get a lot of cast speed and just percent damage, which is super nice. Shimmeron, which I think is a power charge stacking wand, if I'm not mistaken. Nebulock, which is a endurance charge stacking mace. Take a look into those if you do have that 100% uptime. It's just like an interesting way to mitigate some of the downsides that would otherwise be present on those as a resource. So you can also use health as a resource here, and I use that a lot with my BV life stacking Slayer. Spending health as a means of power, and then obviously just shooting back up to full in the next server tick feels super strong, so it's great for things like Bone Shatter and Trauma, where you're hitting yourself and obviously you're chunked for 20% of your health. Right back up to full. Sacrifice Support, similar sort of thing, where you spend your health to do more damage. There's the Echoes of Creation helmet, which each time you do an attack that's been exerted by war cries, you take damage. This helps to regen all of that health. There's Forbidden Rite and Dark Pact, which spend health as a means of doing more damage. I do want to highlight Doedre's Elixir. So this is kind of like a sleeper pick for lower to mid-game builds. If you're struggling to find a way to generate Power Frenzy and Endurance charges, you take 50% of your max life as KS damage on use. Oh no, it's back to full after a server tick. So, but it does give you all of the charges that you need for your build, especially if you're not investing in charges. It's just a nice way to get those charges almost as like a free, pressing this flask every 10 seconds, making sure that those are up. Really nice way to just kind of close that gap for generating charges early game. There's obviously Blood Magic and Life Tap, making sure that if you're spending health to proc your skills, that also gets regened. But I do want to reiterate that Disillusion of the Flesh cannot be used here. There's a ton of life stacking builds that use Disillusion of the Flesh. You'll have to remove the 30% more life modifier from those builds, which means your damage probably goes down as well as your max hit. So watch out for those if you're planning on incorporating or just taking the shell of a life stacker and moving it into a Tainted Pact structure, that you probably want to remove that jewel. There's a few other notable niches here that I'm not going to expand on too much. I talked about before. Daggers with Adder's Touch and Pneumatic Dagger, just a super easy way to enable Tainted Pact from a poison perspective. Replica Abyssus, this is great for Divine Flesh because the downside, which would be 40% increased elemental damage taken, since you're only taking 50% is elemental and 50% is chaos, all of a sudden the downside is halved. You can even go even further than that and put on like Juggernaut, or there's a Bound by Destiny jewel, there's Incandescent Heart, which all of a sudden you're taking 85% of elemental damage as chaos, and you only have to worry about that 15%, so 15 times 40 is 6% increased elemental damage taken. Really good synergy there. Eldritch Battery is nice because with Divine Flesh, all damage bypasses ES anyway, so you might as well spend it for something. You might as well spend it for your mana cost for your skills if you can reach the notable all the way in the top right of the tree. It's just a nice thing to have. There is the Black Flame plus the Fulcrum. Little unexplored from my perspective. I've kind of had issues making it work in the past, but I did want to make sure that it was called out. Black Flame makes it so that enemies take chaos damage instead of fire damage from ignites, and then you can reflect that ignite back to you so that you're taking a chaos dot and you can heal from it. Not going to go too much further into that. I feel like it's kind of not great because you're doing an ignite build anyways, and getting enough leech can be kind of a hassle. So there's also the Transcendent Flesh and Lethal Pride. So this was really popular back in the day, but if you're like a Scion or something like that, you have the middle of the tree, it's possible to get, if you have the Lethal Pride jewel and 2 of these Transcendent Flesh jewels, you can get 175% of multi, crit strike multi, just from that combination. However, it comes with a nasty downside of less life recovery rate, but we're Tainted Pact. Like I said before at the beginning of the video, Tainted Pact doesn't care about less life recovery rate, so there's no real downside to running this. Obviously, you don't have Divine Flesh from the Lethal Pride, but it is an option if you decide to go that route. And then I just also want to reiterate here that faster hits per second equals less poison investment. So if you're running Cyclone, which is hitting 10 times a second, that's going to be a lot easier to get poisons back on yourself than something that's hitting once per second. It all comes down to what feels good at the end of the day. Alright, with defensive synergies, there's a few things here, but I feel like they all kind of tell the same story, which we want to scale max hit as much as possible, because that's kind of the other vector that we have defensively. We don't care about avoidance. We have the recovery solved, so the only other thing that we care about is max hit. So I'm just going to list a few things about max hit that synergize well. One of them being Fortify. Obviously, you can get the champ Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame jewels if you do decide to go Slayer. Life stacking, which is spending health. The more health you have, the more you can tank things. So that's why I ended up doing with the BV life stacking Slayer. That worked out really well. Petrified Blood, like I talked about before, there's the Overleech and Dot mitigation. Progenesis works really well with Petrified Blood because they're additive on each other, and so that makes your max hit just kind of scale to the moon once you put those two together. I'm sure you might be aware of other builds that also use that as a combination. You probably want to scale your maximum elemental resistance as high as possible because you get a net healing from Dot if you decide to do it that way with Divine Flesh. If you have like a 90% maximum elemental resistance versus your 80% chaos resistance, that 10% difference means that you get more health. I do want to call out the Apex Supremacy again here. Apex Supremacy also gives 3% of maximum resistances, which includes chaos, while you're poisoned. But then it also gives the QOL of having longer poisons on yourself. So if you can get that to work, it just feels really nice. Spell Suppression, obviously really good for max hit, but also I just want to call out Magebane, which can work in tandem with, and I'll call it out over here too, with Iron Reflexes. If you're getting rid of evasion anyways, who cares whether or not your evasion is higher or lower? You might as well just invest it all into max hit. So Magebane, as a notable in the tree, is just super high value. Endurance charges from Slayer's Masterful Form are just kind of like a shoe-in for a lot of builds if you decide to go the Slayer route. Really nice from a defensive perspective, and just super strong as of the time of this video on 3.26. And then a bunch of Divine Flesh stuff. So the Fourth Vow, which makes it so your armor protects your chaos damage. Doppelganger's Guise is a really good pick to mitigate physical and chaos damage. I think you take 40% less damage, less physical and chaos damage while sane, which is all the time. You're not going to be toggling that on. Really good if you can't, if you're struggling to find a way to get enough physical mitigation without a ton of armor on your build. There's Incandescent Heart and Bound by Destiny, like I talked about before. You can just move more of that elemental damage into chaos damage. Juggernaut's nice. It's almost like a mini Fourth Vow because there's a notable that gives 15% of armor covering your chaos damage taken. And then there's Strength of Blood, which is, there's no Divine Flesh here, but it is an option on the Lethal Pride jewel, which makes it so that you don't get recovery from Life Leech, but you get extra physical damage reduction per percentage of Life Leech you'll get otherwise. This doesn't turn off, I want to reiterate, this doesn't turn off the Leech instance, so Tainted Pact will still work, you just won't recover from it. And then obviously Mageblood. Mageblood is crazy. You can get a ton of armor from it, you can get a ton of max elemental resistances from it. If you're already at the stage where you can get a Mageblood, I think you can take it from here. So, defensive cores, so things I like to put together for builds like these. I really like the combination of Divine Flesh plus a Watcher's Eye and then a third piece of the puzzle. What this allows you to do is shift two of your elements into one element and have like a 50%, let's say lightning versus, and then 50% of chaos, and that's where all of your damage is taken, so you can ignore those fire and cold resists completely. Sublime Vision feels really good here. You do lose all of your other auras though, so you would only run Purity of Lightning. This is what I do on my BV Slayer, but it does free up a ton of suffix pressure. You don't have to worry about gearing for fire and cold resistance. It just feels really nice. Taste of Hate is another option. It does only cover hits though, so you still have to worry about fire and cold, or I'm sorry, it would be fire and lightning damage over time. So if you had like a negative resist there, it might hurt. But if you're already regenning for 100,000 health per second, that might not be an issue. Something to think about. I haven't implemented it in a build myself yet, but it's definitely somewhere hidden in a discarded POB somewhere. So it's something to look into. And then there's the Font of Thunder shield, which is cheap. It turns, I think it's fire, 40% of fire and cold into lightning damage. And then you can use Bound by Destiny to shift the rest if you really want to, which is just a super cheap way. You don't have to worry about using Watcher's Eye or any of the Purity auras. You also don't lose your auras as well. Obviously, you're using a shield slot for it, but it is definitely a very nice way to enable this synergy here. One of my favorite ways to deal with physical damage mitigation with Tainted Pact is using Iron Reflexes plus Mage Bane plus Unwavering Stance. So Iron Reflexes turns all of your evasion into armor. Mage Bane makes it so that you just get less evasion, which is fine, but you get more spell suppression. And then Unwavering Stance makes it so you can't evade attacks, which all of a sudden we don't care about if you're using Iron Reflexes, and you can't get stunned. A lot of nice QOL here, but we can take it a step further if you are a Slayer. If you are a Slayer, you have Masterful Form, which stacks Frenzy and Endurance charges. And then there's the Armor and Evasion Mastery, which is 8% of armor, or you get 8% increased armor for every Endurance charge and 8% increased evasion for every Frenzy charge. Do note that those are separate modifiers, so they can scale on each other. So if you're moving your evasion to armor via Iron Reflexes, all of a sudden if you have, let's say, 8 charges in both, you're getting 64% increased evasion. That gets turned into armor, and then it gets increased again as another 64% increased value. Multiply that with any sort of Grace or Determination slap in, and all of a sudden you have 40, 50,000 armor pretty easily. You might just need a little bit of armor on your builds. Maybe you want to invest your body armor, or if you're using like a helmet or something like that, just get a good amount of evasion or armor on your gear, and you should be good to go on that front. I wanted to include the spicy Juggernaut, Incandescent Heart, Bound by Destiny 3, Born of Chaos. Born of Chaos is a Cluster Jewel notable that gives +3 maximum chaos resistance, so you get 90 chaos res, shifting 85% of elemental damage to chaos, and then running a replica Abyssus so that you don't have to worry about just a 6% sliver there. I haven't tried it myself. It just seems good on paper. It might not be good in practice, but wanted to call out. And then, of course, with Sublime Vision, like I was talking before, you do lose all your other auras, but there are things that aren't auras. So maybe you might want to run this with Auto Exertion. That doesn't count as... you can still reserve mana for Auto Exertion and automatically apply stuff for slams. One of the things I did in my Flicker Strike build is I actually invested a little bit more into Herald of Ice, so that Herald of Ice felt a lot stronger. With AoE, with gem levels, that sort of thing, just to get better explosions. There are other options that are outside of auras that you can look into. I know that there's like Temporal Rift, there's Arctic Armor, there's other options, but keep that in mind if you do decide to go the Sublime Vision route. There's a lot of freedom that you can move with there, and it does feel good from a defensive perspective 100%. Alright, let's go through some examples. We're nearing the end of the presentation here, so bear with me. This is just the real-life examples of what I went through in 3.26, and these are all kind of endgame builds. I hope I can get some content in the future where there's lower to middle budget builds along the way, but I do want to at least highlight what's out here already and some of the decisions that I decided to put into these builds that I had in 3.26. The first one being Cyclone. Excuse me, just need a little bit of water. So this build, it says 2.9 million damage. It's more like 16 if you throw it in PoE. I loved this build. It felt really good from a staff perspective, being able to knock back stuff if you get a critical strike with a staff. This build could basically deal with every single map modifier, sans the monsters cannot be leeched from, which wasn't a problem if you just regix it out. From a defensive perspective, we can see that we have 7 endurance charges, 1 coming from the staff, I think all 3 on the tree. We have, the max hit, there's something going on here. I should probably throw this in PoB. This is actually a lot worse on the PoE Ninja than it is in PoB, but what we have here, we have 53,000 armor. We have 86 chaos resistance, so I decided to go the route of increasing chaos resistance to mitigate that as an elemental check. I did run regular Abyssus here, but because I had 53,000 armor, that actually really didn't feel like an issue. We had explosions from the chest piece. We had these crazy onslaught boosts that I luckily hit, and of course I don't even use suppress, I don't think. Yeah, because I'm more of the left side of the tree. There's the Divine Flesh, like I talked about before. There's Iron Reflexes, so that's where I'm getting most of my armor. There's the Blood-Soaked Blade Tincture, which this tincture is just an insane amount of damage. It's like a plus 60% DPS modifier, so definitely don't sleep on tinctures. But yeah, that was pretty much, so there's like the 15% chance to poison on hit, like I was talking about with the implicits on the gloves. Trying to think of what else I had here. There's the 21% chance to poison on hit on the weapon from a Veiled mod. I think that's pretty much it. If we go to the next build, which is the Flicker Strike Rakiatas, there was some new technology that I think, who was it that came up with it? I watched a video from somebody. Go watch their video, and I'm sure if you've heard of it before, you might have heard it from another content creator, but this was using the Sublime Vision technology, so the taking 30% of fire and lightning damage is cold damage, the Watcher's Eye getting the other 20%, and then Divine Flesh, all of a sudden I only care about the 90% cold res, don't care about fire or lightning. About the same amount of armor as before. Spell suppression, I actually went 100% in. So this one felt a little bit tankier than the other one. There is the replica Abyssus, like I was talking about before, just to add more elemental damage to attacks. And then you'll see like the +2 to level of socketed cold gems at the top. This is where I took Herald of Ice. Actually increase it with Awaken added cold damage support, and then Awaken increased AoE support. This felt really good, just flicking into like a breach pack and just exploding the screen. Obviously, this build scales endurance and frenzy charges. This is definitely an expensive build with the frenzy charge rings. But you can see that I used just the leech from the monsters in the map. It felt really comfortable. It's obviously there's downsides to running into monsters that don't have the leech, but like I was saying before, Slayer has the 100% increased maximum recovery per life leech, so leeches last 10 seconds, so bouncing between packs, it will probably cover your ass in between packs if you decide to run into a problematic rare. The Green Nightmare, like I talked about before, this gives the 10% of cold as extra chaos. This was enough. You can see chaos is only 2% of my damage, but it was enough to reflect poisons and still feel really good. What else here? I think that's pretty much it for this build. We do have the Mage Bane giving us spell suppression. And then, of course, Rakiatas, which was treating enemy monster elemental resistances values as inverted. This is the technology I was talking about before. I don't know if it actually shows up here. But there was the Rune Graft that makes it so enemies have or are affected by your enemies are affected by your auras, which is Purity of Ice, which means that their elemental resistance was like 80-85, and then I was treating that as negative, which means it's negative 85. like I was saying, I forget who brought that up. It might have been earlier in the league. Comment down below if you have heard of it before, but it was something I wanted to try out, and it worked out really well. I feel like every single league I try Flicker, I'm like, oh, Flicker's great, and then 2 days into it, I'm like, you know what? I'm starting to feel a little sick, so let's move to another one. And then, of course, the life stacking Blade Vortex that I had talked about previously. I have a whole video on this. Please go check it out. This was probably my favorite implementation of Tainted Pact so far. Insane maximum hit. 4 million is more like 16.5 in the PoB. So, and then this build scales a lot into explosions. It just feels super nice. So, look more into that. If you have any questions about these builds, feel free to put them in the comments. I'm going to be pretty active there too. And that is it. Whew. We made it. If you watched the entire video, seriously, I sincerely appreciate it. It was a very long video. I'll be, like I was saying before, I'll be active in the comments trying to answer any questions you may have. If you have any feedback from the entire process, if you felt like I could have been a little bit more clear in certain points, I'll be happy to discuss that in the comments as well. Huge shout out to literally all of the PoE content creators out there. I'm a new content creator myself, and I found out real quick that this is hard. There's a lot of work that you have to put into making a video that people actually want to watch. So, and especially because PoE is just a beautiful mess of a game. I've personally relied on countless hours of content from others to help understand what a fraction of the game actually has to offer. So, go to your favorite content creator, like, comment, and subscribe their videos, any sort of content that they have, especially if they're making a living out of it. It goes a long way. And also mine, shameless plug, but I have a lot of plans for this channel. I think I've got some ideas floating around. Actually, I'm gonna hop into this next slide, which I decided to nix from the explanation of Tainted Pact, but I wanted to go through at a certain point how to build around specific interactions. Maybe I'll save this for another video and expand upon this sort of thing. But I've been talking for way too long, as you can already tell. I've got spicy build ideas for 3.27, barring some patch notes that are coming up. This is recording on October 21st. I think there's going to be the announcements on Thursday, which is in 2 days, so I'm excited to see what happens there. But I think I would like to start a series regarding just like the fundamentals of PoE. Something akin to thinking like, I call it like thinking like a 2%er, right? Where you're smart enough to be ahead of the curve, but you don't have enough time to be diaper gaming for 2 months every league. So, just understanding what makes certain farm strategies or build archetypes good can help you find farms before your favorite content creator ruins the price for it, right? So, comment down below if there's something you're interested in. I have played this game for almost 7,000 hours. I know a lot by now, hopefully. And I would just love to share any sort of information I have. Otherwise, I've had a blast preaching about something I'm passionate about. I love Tainted Pact. I hope you guys will too. So thank you again for tuning in. I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.